Well, again, we're so thankful to be here this evening. So good to be together again. And I want to, before I get into the lesson this evening, just say how much I appreciated being here. I thank you to begin with for the invitation to come, and it's just such a privilege for me to be able to share God's Word with those that love to hear it, and I can tell that you love to hear it, and you've been here patiently listening, many of you every service. I'm thankful for that. I want to thank you for taking care of me so well this week in physical ways, certainly feeding me well enough, and several of you had part in that, and I've got to eat with some of you and at the expense of some of you, but mainly, I thank you for that, and it's from the bottom of my heart, but you really are thanking somebody for the time you got to spend together and the association and sharing one another's lives together with people of like precious faith. Sometimes talking about your faith and sometimes just talking about life. But it's a special experience. Everywhere we go as Christians, we have family, and I truly feel that that's the case. And the worship that we've experienced together has been outstanding. The singing has been uplifting. The prayers have been heartfelt. And all that we've engaged in has been very encouraging to me. I get typically more out of a gospel meeting, certainly, than I feel like I give, and that's true this week as well. Reconnecting with several of you and getting to know some of you that I've never known before. But that relationship and sharing together in the family of God is just precious, and I thank you for the experience this week. We've been talking about glorifying God, and I think we've been striving to do that. We want to continue to strive to do that and to get better at it. We are to exist to the glory of God, as we talked about Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 12. We mentioned that, I think, in every service so far, and Paul's saying to us in 1 Corinthians that whatever we do, let's do it to the glory of God. So we're learning about the need to glorify God, His worthiness of that, how to go about it, showing love as we ought to, living holy lives as we ought to, giving our gifts of mainly ourselves to Him, and sharing with others the gifts that He's given us. Those are some of the things that we've talked about along the lines of glorifying God. And I'm going to, in this final lesson of the series, go to the book of Nehemiah tonight with you. And I want to talk about Nehemiah as a person who was living for the glory of God. Much more, I think, than many of us would appreciate or understand, unless we have really studied the character of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is a character that many people don't know much about. Even people who know a good bit of the Bible may not know a whole lot about Nehemiah. He's famous for rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem after the Babylonians had destroyed them earlier. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But that's only a small part of his accomplishment. He was governor of Judea for a while, and that's going to come into the story a little bit. He was a righteous man, and he was a leader of others to righteousness. He accomplished so much in the way of worship to God and work for God and encouraging others to work for God and worship Him in a right and holy way. He's really one of the more amazing characters of the Old Testament, frankly, and I would hold him on par with any person of faith in the Old Testament as far as his way of glorifying the God of heaven. We're introduced to Nehemiah in chapter 1. He's still in Persia in the land of captivity. The Jews had been allowed to go home decades before, but many Jews had, for one reason or another, had to stay in the land of captivity. Maybe they were servants in somebody's house or had other responsibilities or had lands and families that they couldn't leave, but many stayed in the lands of captivity in what was once Babylon and now Persia. And yet many had gone back as well. And so the temple had been rebuilt and service had been restored to the temple, and things were going well as far as that goes. But the people of God who had gone back, the Israelites who were reestablishing the nation of Israel, they were exposed to their enemies. And the temple itself was exposed to their enemies. The people of the land, like Moabites and Ammonites and other ancient foes of Israel still dwelt in the land to some extent. And they didn't really like the Jews being back there. They might even harass or attack the Jews from time to time. So that's the situation with Nehemiah. When he gets a report from Jerusalem, his brother Hananiah comes back and he asks him, how are things going back home, in our home country with the people who've returned from captivity. And Hananiah says, well, they're not good. The walls are still broken down and the gates are burned and our people are exposed to the people of the land. It's just really not good. And Nehemiah becomes extremely upset and distraught. And he weeps and he prays for days and days and is so concerned about the welfare of God's people who are reestablishing the worship of God in a proper way with the temple back in Jerusalem. So as God provides, Nehemiah gets this opportunity to go back and be a leader in rebuilding the walls. He's a cupbearer for the King Artaxerxes, the Persian king. And on an occasion, Artaxerxes has a conversation with him, discovers what's in Nehemiah's heart, and Nehemiah tells him, I really want to go back and help my people. And the king says, go. And I'll help you out, and I'll give you materials and men and finances and whatever you need. And Nehemiah goes. And he goes back and he is there for 3 days. He surveys the situation, goes around at night, looks at the walls and the broken down gates, and he gets all the leaders together of Israel and he says, look, you see what a mess we're in here? we got to do something about this. And I imagine when he said that, you ever lived maybe yourself, and maybe you're not a good housekeeper, or as a young person you kept your room a mess all the time, and your mother would come in and say, you see what a mess this is? And you said, well, yeah, I see what a mess it is, so what? And I think that might have been how the leaders of Israel responded. Yeah, we see what a mess this is. We've been living in it for decades. What do you mean you see what a mess? But Nehemiah says, you got to do something. We got to do something about this. And he encourages them. He says, God is with me and God will be with us. Let's the walls. And the people say, let's do it. And he gets them moving. He gets them going. He gets work crews together and he gets the materials together. They start clearing the rubble. They start building the wall all at once. And it's really an amazing feat. Nehemiah chapter 3 talks about how they're working together all the way around at the same time, building the wall up all together at once. It just comes up all at one time. It's an amazing feat of leadership and cooperation. So they get the wall built. And Nehemiah is helping all along. You can read in Nehemiah chapter 5 and verse 19 about some of the things that Nehemiah was doing besides the physical rebuilding of the walls. Earlier in Nehemiah 5, he talks about in verse 17 the people that he's feeding for free. The workers and the rulers are sitting at his table and he's feeding them. In verse 18, he talks about was prepared. It was daily 1 ox and 6 choice sheep. Also fowl were prepared for me once every 10 days, an abundance of all kinds of wine. And he's giving the workers and the leaders all of this food and feeding them all this time and not charging them anything, not receiving the tax that he could have gotten from them as governor. He didn't charge any of those taxes. He's doing all of this. And why is he doing it? Because he loves the people of God and he loves God. And he wants God to be glorified in a proper way by his people. And verse 19 then is really the telltale of what's in Nehemiah's heart. What's in Nehemiah's heart. He says, remember me, my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. See, Nehemiah's desire to be remembered by the God that he lived to glorify. I'm doing this for you, God. Here's what I'm doing to glorify you. Remember me for this. As we're sitting here tonight, you and me, there are a lot of things about our lives we don't want God to remember. And we're thankful that he's willing through Jesus to forgive us of those things. But the point of all of this week is kind of encapsulated in Nehemiah's attitude. We want to be living lives that we want God to remember us for. Because we have glorified him with our lives and in our lives. And how many of us could say what Nehemiah is saying? To pray to God and say, God, at the end of this day, remember me for what I did today to glorify you. And shouldn't that be the case every night when we pillow our head? That we could say, today, God, I wasn't perfect, but I did things to glorify you. Remember the good I did. Please forgive me for the bad. That's Nehemiah. That's what he's living for. He is extraordinarily successful as a leader. And go to Nehemiah chapter 6 and verse 15. The people had a mind to work, so they get a lot of credit for what happens. But Nehemiah 6 and verse 15, the wall was finished on the 25th day of Elul in 52 days. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought about that. They're building a fortified wall around a major, some circumference, with essentially non-construction workers. There were priests and there were perfumers and there were all sorts of people that were doing this work. None of them were construction workers, but they did the work. And none of them particularly were warriors, but they had to hold swords and spears and shields because the people of the land were them with attack the whole time that they're building the wall. So you have a fortified wall built around a large city under those sorts of circumstances in 52 days. Now, I know they can put Dollar Generals up pretty quick, but 52 days for that wall at that time, it's amazing. It's not miraculous, but you think, that's a miracle. How could anybody do that? That's a credit to Nehemiah and to these people. They're determined to get this wall built so that now they might worship God in security and be his people. As long as the people of the land are allowed just to walk through Jerusalem, you've got all sorts of unclean people and evil things going on all the time. But now they can have a wall and just let certain people in and keep certain people out. We're going to see that in a few minutes. That's how one of the things that will happen. So Nehemiah and the people are absolutely thrilled. Nehemiah organizes a dedication for the wall. We can read about that. I'm skipping over quite a bit in the book of Nehemiah, but we could read about that in chapter 12. You go forward, and there are these big choirs that Nehemiah puts together and gets this big procession like a parade to dedicate the wall once it's completed. And you get to Nehemiah chapter 12, if I can turn over there. And you notice, just in verse 43, we're picking up at the end of all this, but some of the description of it. That day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. And the women and the children also rejoiced, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard afar off. I mean, people were singing, they were praising, they were sacrificing, and the joy of the worship and the glorification of God himself is heard in the lands all around. It's so loud. People just shouting for joy and worshiping God. And at that same time, verse 44, some were appointed over the rooms of the storehouse for the offerings, the first fruits, the tithes, to gather them from the fields of the cities, the portion specified by the law for the priests and the Levites. For Judah rejoiced over her priests and Levites who ministered. So now they've restored not only the worship, but the people who are coordinating and leading in the worship. They're now supporting them, and that's organized in a proper way. So all of this is going again so that God may be glorified in a way, and worshipped in a way that he deserves. That's the intent of everything here. And you see it running through that thread, running through everything that happens, really, in the book of Nehemiah. And we're still on the same day as Nehemiah explains to us. On that day, that same day, they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people. It was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever come into the assembly of God. Now, they're probably reading from Deuteronomy 23, where that is part of the law that specified that no Moabite or Ammonite should come into the assembly. And the reason is in verse 2, because they had not met the children of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. You may remember the children of Israel coming up out of the wilderness wandering, about to enter the promised land. They get to Moab and they get to Ammon, and the Moabites and the Ammonites are not really happy with them and try to stop them, and you remember all that. Instead of helping them, they become their enemies. Well, from Nehemiah's time, that was 900 years ago. But you know what? A law of God that's 900 years old, you know what it is? It's still a law of God. Unless God has changed it, it's still a law of God. And so these people read it, and here's their mindset. We're going to glorify God. We may have put up with this Moabite, Ammonite stuff for 900 years, but we're not doing it anymore. And that was the attitude. God's going to be glorified. And they set their hearts and their minds to do that. It says, so it was when they heard the law, they separated all the mixed multitude from Israel. We're just got to ferret all these people out. But, as Nehemiah goes on to explain, before this time, it hadn't been that way. In fact, Nehemiah had to deal with a problem. He says, before this, Eliashib the priest, having authority over the storerooms of the house of our God, was allied with Tobiah. If you read through the book of Nehemiah, you find Tobiah's a bad dude. Okay? Tobiah, earlier on, we find out, was one of the enemies of the land.
Yes.
That was against the Israelites being there and rebuilding. He was among those named in chapter 2 and verse 19 that laughed at the children of Israel for trying to rebuild the wall. Mm-hmm. Oh, whatever you build, a fox is going to knock it down. You know, yes. It's not going to work. Right. And then in chapter 4, verses 7 and 8, he was one of the ones who conspired to attack the builders and the workers when they were working. In chapter 6 and verse 12, Tobiah was one who hired a false prophet to speak against Nehemiah, to stir up trouble for Nehemiah as he's trying to get all of this done. And in chapter 6 and verse 20, he actually sent letters to terrify Nehemiah and the workers. None of that worked. But you get the idea. Tobiah is a tooth and toenail enemy of the people of God. But he's related by marriage, apparently, to the high priest, Eliashib. And so Eliashib's friendly with him. And Eliashib says, you know what, we've got this empty room next to the temple. I know the Levite storehouse, that's supposed to be where we keep the goods collected for them, but we'll empty that out and we'll let you stay in there. So he's literally an enemy of the people of God, staying in the sanctuary, in the holy temple. The very person that the wall was designed to keep out is in the temple. So, you see why Nehemiah's mad in the picture, right? Nehemiah's not going to put up with that. You see what he does? Eliashib was allied with Tobiah. Verse 5 says, he prepared for him a large room where previously they'd stored the grain offerings, frankincense, the articles, the tithes of grain, the new wine and oil, which were commanded to be given to the Levites and singers and gatekeepers, and the offerings for the priests. But during all of this, I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Then after certain days I obtained leave from the king, and I came to Jerusalem and discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah in preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. And it grieved me bitterly. Well, why? That's not glorifying God. Not treating an enemy of God treating an enemy of God like that's not glorifying God. So he says, I threw all the household goods of Tobiah out of the room. He moved in to the temple. Basically, Nehemiah says, I threw them all out. And I commanded them to cleanse the rooms, and I brought back into them the articles of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. He evicts Tobiah. He brings everything else back in. And then he says, I realize the portions for the Levites have not been being paid as they should. I don't know if it reminds you of anybody or anything else to read this action of Nehemiah in casting out Tobiah. But it reminds me a little bit of something that happens in John 2 with the cleansing of the temple. When Jesus comes into the temple and they're selling the oxen and the doves and the lambs and the money changers are in there, and he doesn't like any of that, does he? And he turns over the tables and tells the sellers of the doves, don't make my Father's house a house of merchandise. That's not what the temple is for. There's nothing wrong with selling doves. People need change money to pay the tax. That's okay to do if you're fair with them. But you don't turn the temple into a place where common, everyday human activities are engaged in. Because the temple is to glorify God, not satisfy human beings. Now, may I say to you that the temple of God today is the church.
That's right.
And when we make the church into something that pleases us instead of Him, we have done what Tobiah did and what Eliashib allowed to be done.
Amen.
If we're going to glorify God, the church, the temple of God, must be used for holy purposes to glorify God. There's nothing wrong with eating meals. There's nothing wrong with recreational activities. There's nothing wrong with making money. None of that is the work of the church. None of it. And yet the world largely doesn't understand that.
That's right.
And the world is like, well, you can just make the church into anything you want it to be because the church is for you.
Yes.
No, it's to glorify God. Now that'll help you a lot if you glorify God. I hope you see what we can learn from Nehemiah. Nehemiah realized that the Levites weren't being supported there in verse 10, I should say. I realized that the portions of the Levites had not been given them, for each of the Levites and the singers who did the work had gone back to his field. Again, you know why that is, because, well, Tobiah had been living in the room where their goods were being kept. And people were bringing tithes in. The tithes were supposed to be given, you probably know this, but the reason for the giving of tithes was to support the priests and the Levites. That's why Israel gave tithes. That was the very purpose of that. So that those that were working in the spiritual services of the temple would not have to work their fields and do all the menial work and could focus on the spiritual work so that that work could be carried on in a proper and good way. But that wasn't carried on in a proper and good way because the Levites had to leave town to work their fields because they were not being supported because the goods weren't there. They weren't being stored. They weren't being kept. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 12 and verse 19, the command there was, take heed to yourself that you do not forsake the Levite as long as you live in the land. As long as they're in the land, they're to be supporting the Levites. But Nehemiah finds the situation to be different. In the church today, as long as we're comparing apples to apples, or maybe oranges a little bit, but in the church today, even so the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. Mm-hmm. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 14. Now I understand, and you understand, and the Bible teaches that anyone who's worthy of preaching the gospel is also going to be somebody who's willing to work with his hands to support himself if he needs to. The Apostle Paul did it repeatedly. In Acts chapter 20 and verse 34, he tells the Ephesian elders, you know that these hands are provided for my necessities and for those who are with me. He made tents, literally made tents. We get that phrase today, being a tent maker, from Paul being a tent maker and being willing to support himself and others. And he tells the Thessalonians the same thing, 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 7. You know how you ought to follow us. We were not disorderly among you, nor did we eat anyone's bread free of charge, but worked with labor, toil night and day, that we might not be a burden to you. So that's the attitude of anybody who's going to preach the gospel, to be willing to do that. But Paul makes the argument to the Corinthians that that's also what he did at Corinth, but he shouldn't have had to. Because it's God's commandment that those who preach the gospel should live of the gospel. Paul was willing to do it. He received support from other churches to preach in Corinth, but he didn't take it from them so that the gospel wouldn't be hindered there. Go with me and read what he tells them in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. He says in verse 7, he asks the question in verse 6, is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working? Whoever goes to war at his own expense, who plants a vineyard and does not even eat of its fruit, who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock? Do I say these things as a mere man, or does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it oxen God is concerned with? Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, was it written, that he who plows should plow in hope, he who threshes in hope should be partaker of his hope. If we've sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap material things? If others have partaken of this right over you, are we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but endure all things lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. So he's making these arguments, several of them, to say, look, if somebody works at something, that the laborer is worthy of his hire, and he deserves to be supported. And he says that's what the Old Testament law said. He talks about the not muzzling the ox, the treading out the grain, all of that. Now, I'll point you to verse 14 is the verse I referenced a minute ago. Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. So that's the point that he's driving to. But you might say, well, how does the support of the Levites parallel to that? And is it parallel? Verse 13 answers that for us. Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat the things of the temple, and those who serve at the altar partake of the offerings of the altar? What Nehemiah is doing in Nehemiah 13 is he's straightening things out in the religion of Judaism so that the preachers get paid. Just to put it bluntly. So that the priests and the Levites who are doing the spiritual service are supported to do that as they should. Now I'm saying all this just really as a side point to the main point of this lesson, obviously. But supporting the preaching of the gospel glorifies God. Your sacrifice to do that and the preaching itself elevates the name of God among humankind. And that's what we're all interested in. And there are those who are preaching the gospel who need to be supported. They need it for their families. They need it so they can focus on the work of preaching the gospel instead of making tents. And we need to be concerned with glorifying God in that and doing things the way God wants them done. Nehemiah's support of God's workers made him a fellow worker with them. If we go back to Nehemiah chapter 13, he straightens it all out in verse 11. He gathers them together. All of Judah brought the tithes and the grain and the new wine and the oil to the storehouse. He appoints treasurers over all of it to make sure it gets taken care of in a proper way, and the distribution of the support goes out to the priests and Levites in the way that it should. He appoints faithful men over all of that in verse 13. And then guess what he says in verse 14? Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for its services. Now, Nehemiah wasn't doing any of the services in the house of God. What was he doing? He was seeing to it that they got done, and that the people who were doing it were supported in doing it. That's what we call fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
Jointly sharing in an activity. And that's what we do when we support faithful preachers. The Apostle John writes about receiving those who've gone forth to spread the gospel. And when you receive them, you become a fellow worker for the truth. Paul writes to the Philippians and commends them for sending to his needs once again. Even when he was in Macedonia, he received support from Philippi, most likely even in Corinth, one of the churches that were supporting him there. But he says about that, even in Thessalonica, this is Philippians chapter 4 and verse 16, even in Thessalonica, you sent aid once again for my necessities, not that I seek for the gift, but I seek for the fruit that abounds to your account. If this church supports the preaching of the gospel, then whoever you support in preaching the gospel in that way, whatever he accomplishes, that goes to your account as well. So I realize as a gospel preacher that in every sermon that I preach, in every Bible study that I have, in every trip that I make for the gospel's sake, that there are literally hundreds of Christians who are having fellowship with me and have a part in every last thing I do. I'm talking about in the eyes of God. It's all going to glorify God. That's what fellowship is. So not everybody is working full-time as a gospel preacher, but everybody can participate in that work by encouraging it and supporting it. And I should also say, I'm not asking for a raise. You all don't even have a full-time preacher here, so I'm not asking for him to have a raise. What I am saying is that let's glorify God. Let's make sure that people, we've come from a time where I think a lot of folks begrudged even paying a preacher in a generation gone by. That's not true anymore, and I'm thankful that that's the case. But there are men who need support who aren't getting it, both in this country and abroad. There could be much more being done with the gospel in some areas if men were receiving proper support. So those are some things to think about. Yes. That same principle is true today. Let's go on to the book of Nehemiah before I get too bogged down. And look at Nehemiah chapter 13 now in verse 15. Under the law, the Lord did not approve of working on the Sabbath. I guess that's generally known. The bearing of burdens, the buying and selling of goods was forbidden on the Sabbath day. You can look at Exodus 20, Exodus 34, Jeremiah 17, on all of that. And in fact, the law was so strict that even animals were forbidden from working on the Sabbath day. You couldn't even work your animal on the Sabbath day. So that was part of the holiness of God's people. They were to be much, much different from everybody else. And that was set up in the law to make them separate and pure from everybody else. Nehemiah stopped the people from working on the Sabbath. Read it with me now in Nehemiah 13. He says, in those days I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in sheaves and loading donkeys with wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them about the day on which they were selling provisions. Men of Tyre dwelt also, who brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the children of Judah in Jerusalem. And I contended with the nobles of Judah and said to them, what evil thing is this that you do by which you profane the Sabbath? Did not your fathers do that thus? And did not God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Yet you bring added wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath day. Why was Jerusalem destroyed? Why are we having to go through all of this? It's because our fathers didn't keep the Sabbath. Was one reason. They were violating God's law in lots of ways, but that was one. And he said, do you want God to destroy us again? I'm not letting it happen. It's not going to happen. So it was at the gates of Jerusalem, as it began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded, he's the governor of the land, I commanded that the gates be shut. notice this, the gates can be shut because there are gates now.
Mm-hmm.
The wall and the gates keep people from coming in that don't belong.
Right.
See what Nehemiah is able to do? Because he wanted to glorify God and got that wall built. Now, the gates can be shut, and he charged that they must not be open until after the Sabbath. I posted some of my servants at the gates so that no burdens would be brought in on the Sabbath day. The merchants and the sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice, as if we're waiting for the gates to open or we're going to try to sneak in while nobody's looking to sell goods. And he says, I warned them and said to them, why do you spend the night around the wall? If you do it again, I will lay hands on you. And he does not mean in a good way, laying hands on them. I will lay hands on you. From that time on, they came no more on the Sabbath. I wouldn't either. I commanded the Levites they should cleanse themselves. They should go and guard the gates of the sanctuary. And then he says, third time we've seen it, remember me, oh my God. See what I'm doing? I'm glorifying God. I'm seeing that God is glorified. Remember me, oh my God, concerning this, and spare me according to your greatness and your mercy. Nehemiah stopped the people from working on the Sabbath. There are certain things that should be done at certain times and certain things that should not be done at certain times. The Lord's Supper, for instance, on the first day of the week. There's the time for that. There's the place for that in the assembly of the church. Those are the confines of it. Just as God had certain times in the Old Testament, same way. We monkey with that, it displeases God. It does not glorify Him. What glorifies God is not me, feeling some emotional whatever when I'm taking the Lord's Supper. So I need to, turn the lights off and sing Kumbaya or whatever it is while the Lord's Supper is going on in order to get the feeling that I want. That's not what the Lord's Supper is about.
Amen.
Is it? Let's do it the way God said do it.
Amen.
And that, I think we've got brethren that have left that behind.
Yes.
So whether you're talking about giving, the Lord's Supper, eating common meals is great. It's not a work of the church. If anyone's hungry, let him eat at home. That's as plain as it can be. That's not a work of the church. Individual Christians in homes and restaurants, as we've done, that's great.
Sure.
That's not the work of the church. Purity has to be maintained. Holiness has to be maintained if God's going to be glorified. That's what this morning's lesson was about. And just briefly, let me show this to you in Nehemiah chapter 13. In those days, he says in verse 23, he saw Jews who married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. You guys remember 20 minutes ago, problems with Ammon and Moab, not supposed to be. And we've learned that lesson, but now all of a sudden we haven't learned that lesson.
Mm-hmm.
Now you've got people intermarrying with people of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half their children spoke the language of Ashdod and could not even speak the language of Judah, but spoke according to the language of one or the other people. They're not even culturally Jews anymore. They're not Israelites. They're not even acting like the people of God. They don't even know the lingo because they've been so influenced by the world. Does that sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
We got folks running around today to hear them talk. They claim to be Christians, but they don't talk like Christians.
Sure.
They talk like people of the world. They talk about things that people of the world talk about. They talk the way the people of the world talk. Foreign influences cause these people to speak the language of Ashdod. And even so, worldly influences cause God's people today sometimes to speak in a way that we ought not. In Ephesians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul forbids foolish talking and coarse jesting.
Yes.
Those things are common in the world, but they're not even to be named among saints, among holy people. Holiness is important. There's a little phrase that's been in use now for nearly a generation, and it's abbreviated on social media by OMG.
Oh, yes.
And it's just taking God's name in vain. It's It's as simple as that. The world doesn't even think a thing about that. We use God's name in vain, 1,000 times a day and not even consider what they've done. That's an unholy use of God's name.
Mm-hmm.
We're the saints. We're glorifying his name. We're honoring his name. We will in no way use it in a profane or common sense. I hope you understand what I'm saying. Nehemiah rebuked them. He reminded them that, Solomon's fall came because of the influence of foreign women that he married. They influenced him to become an idolater, really, and to turn away from God and to practice the things of the world. When you get to the end of the book of Nehemiah, after all of this is done and Nehemiah straightens all of this out, all to the glory of God, the very last phrase in the book of Nehemiah is this: remember me, O my God. Remember me, O my God, for good. As we close in the next few minutes, I want to focus on that phrase again. And think about really what Nehemiah is saying. He's living, he's working, he's worshiping in view of eternity. He wants everything that he is doing to glorify God. And he wants God to remember it. What a prayer to pray. You have to have a lot of assurance that you're truly striving to do what God wants you to do, to pray that kind of prayer. And I want us to have that kind of confidence. Not a proud thing. I don't see Nehemiah as a proud person at all. He's thankful to be a servant of God. He wants to serve God and please God. And he's just asking God, remember what I'm doing. I just don't forget. It is. Every person's going to be judged by what they do. When the books are open, everyone's judged by what's written in the books according to their works.
Mm-hmm.
Revelation 20 says. And in Revelation chapter 14 and verse 13, John hears a voice from heaven saying, "Right, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their works follow them." So if we're doing that which is good and we've died in the Lord, our good works do us into eternity. That's what Nehemiah knows. Those good works are going with him into eternity. And he's asking God, you just remember these things that I've done to serve you. And it's a just thing and it's a right thing that we want God to remember that. And it's a great motivation for every worker, because God won't forget. He won't forget. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 6 and verse 10, God is not unjust to forget your work and the labor of love, which you have shown toward his name, in that you minister to the saints. We looked at that verse, that passage, right? Just last night. But God's not unjust to forget the work that you've done and the love that you show for others. He'll remember that. He'll remember that cup of cold water that you gave. He'll remember that kind word that you said. He'll remember every way that you glorified his name on this earth.
Mm-hmm.
Let's make our devotion to the Lord memorable. Our work and our worship. In Luke chapter 23, Jesus, in verse 42, is dying on a cross. There are two thieves, one on either side of him. And the one thief said to Jesus in Luke 23 and verse 42, "Lord, remember me when you come in your kingdom." I don't know that that thief had done one good thing, except that he recognized that Jesus is the Lord. And Jesus said to him, "Surely I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Paradise is an interesting word. It's not a Hebrew word. It's not a Greek word. It comes to us out of Persian. It would be a word that Nehemiah would have heard, working in Persia. And the meaning of it is extraordinary. When we think of paradise, what do you think of? Tropical island, right? The beach and sand and all that warm sunshine. The word in Persian is paradisa, and it literally means a wall around. A wall around. So kings in ancient times, and even up to modern times, wanted to have these beautiful spaces where they could have garden parties and nice places to lounge around with friends and family. And they'd put a wall around that, like an English garden type thing, and that would be called paradise. A wall around. In the book of Revelation, when you get to Revelation 21, you know how heaven's described, right? It's got a wall around. And Jesus says that the tree of life is in the midst of the paradise of God.
Mm-hmm.
The thief had said, Lord, remember me. Jesus said, today you'll be with me in paradise.
Mm-hmm.
Nehemiah knew something about a wall around, didn't he?
Mm-hmm.
See, when I was a kid, and growing up, I guess for most of my life, I probably thought every time I saw paradise, it doesn't occur that much in our English translations, but every time I saw that word in the Bible, I would probably think of a tropical island. No, well, going to heaven or going to be with Jesus is like going to a tropical island. No. I've mentioned my dad was in the service, and when I was young, we were stationed on the island of Okinawa,
Mm-hmm.
which a lot of people would consider to be a tropical paradise.
Uh-huh.
I can still remember the banana trees and the sugarcane fields and the hills in the central part of the island with the cherry tree blossoms. Just beautiful. And the sandy beaches and the warm sunshine and every bit of that. When I was a kid, we lived in a house for the first year that we were there that was right on the shore. A coral reef came up to our backyard.
Mm.
And I can still remember laying awake in my bed at night, looking out the window that faced the ocean, and watching the octopus fishermen as they floated their boats over the water, fishing for octopus at night, and they had the little lanterns on the boats that would look like stars floating on the water. And I remember days when, I wasn't allowed to go out on the reef by myself, but days when Dad would be off and he'd come and take me by the hand and he'd say, let's go. And we'd walk out along the shore and you'd see the little sea urchins crawling along among the coral and the starfish, the purple starfish, wiggling around, and Nemo and Dory swimming in the shallows. You ought to look up reefs on Okinawa sometime and some pictures of that. It's really amazing. But I remember that so clearly. And I remember walking along the beach and the smell of the sea and the warmth of the air and the warmth of my daddy's hand. And I would think, that's paradise. That's not paradise. But I think one day, someday soon, maybe, I'll wake up in a land that's evergreen and walk along a golden shore and up a river by the tree of life and come face to face with the one who died for me. And in that moment, I think there'd just be one question I'd like to ask. Just one thing that would be on my mind. And it would be this: Lord, remember me. Remember me. And my hope and prayer would be that he would say, yes, enter in.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I hope for all of us. That's what we've tried to focus on this week. Let's glorify God so that we may be with Him in glory. If that's not what life is about, life's not about anything. Let's make that our lives. Thank you so much for loving God as you do, for being interested in heaven and His glory and yours. If there's one here tonight that needs to respond to the invitation to be a Christian, to live a life that glorifies God, or if there's someone who needs to correct a fault in your life, whatever your need is, we'd ask you to come while we stand and while we sing.
King of my life, I crown thee now, thine shall the glory be. Lest I forget thy thorn crown brow, lead me to Calvary. Lest I forget Gethsemane, lest I forget thine agony, lest I forget thy love for me. Lead me to Calvary. Show me the tomb where thou wast slain, tenderly mourned and well. Angels in robes of light array guarded thee whilst thou slept. Lest I forget Gethsemane, lest I forget thine agony, lest I forget thy love for me. Lead me to Calvary. Let me, like Mary, through the gloom, come with a gift to thee. Show to me now the empty tomb. Lead me to Calvary.